Ever since the legendary ancestors Lech, Czech, and Rus left their homeland and parted ways almost 2 millennia ago, the gods that they and their children worshipped passed through dozens of names in dozens of living and extinct languages, persisting from polytheism into syncretism with Christianity. Their indigenous gods transformed into saints in regional folk variants of faith. Despite church officials declaring that polytheism had died, Slavic scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries rediscovered archaic mythologies, half distorted within contemporary folklore, and their scholarship led the groundwork, so that by the early 20th century, self-identified Slavic polytheists returned. In the 100 years since, the rise of the internet and fall of oppressive regimes have allowed the official and legally recognized return of polytheism in several Slavic majority nations, with tens to hundreds of thousands of adherents across Eastern Europe, which isn't bad for a supposedly dead religion. Many consider the ancient religions, the 1700s rural folk Christianities, and the modern revival to be 3 disconnected religions, while others trace a lineage between them. This series focuses most heavily on the folk religion between the ancient and modern, with its unexpected preservations of bits of polytheism within the superficially Christian. Other channels are better places to seek out if you desire active spiritual guidance or an entryway to one of the living churches. But regardless of your perspective, we still need to ask some major questions. What exactly is Slavic polytheism? What beliefs, philosophies, worldviews, spirits, and gods fall under this term? It's time to start exploring the question, what do Slavic polytheists believe? If one single statement could describe all of Slavic history and religion in a single breath, it would be this. From their cultures, to their languages, to their religions, the Slavs are diverse. Slavic is an umbrella term, in totality as imprecise as all of the Latins of the Romance language-speaking world. There's a misconception for some English speakers, largely thanks to the Cold War, that the Slavic nations are basically all variants of Russia, as if the Latin countries are copies of Mexico, and the biggest idea to take away from this video is that the Slavs are diverse. There is no more correct or less correct Slavic nation. All have descended equally in parallel with each other from the ancient homelands. The Russians or any other Slavs are just dozens of brother languages and brother cultures, as distinct and unique as any other nation. Because of this, there's simply no honest way to encompass every belief from every tradition across the centuries. There's simply too much. So many particular and specific issues, such as the identities of the goddesses of the seasons, or the exact identities of the main god who rules the realm of heaven, all of these will have different answers depending on who you ask and when across the centuries you asked them. This is unavoidable. But still, there must be a place to start, so this video will give answers, typically some of the most widespread or common answers, and often the answers I know the best from my faith passed on to me by my Krakowian family from southern Poland. But it must be stated that my answers are not the only answers, and this is the beginning of a search which can last a lifetime. As we go forth, venture with an eye out for what feels right to you, and keep an open mind. The gods are alive, and any educational resource is merely a tool for them to reach out to you. The most fundamental values of Slavs, first observed by their neighbors and enduring today, are those values imperfectly translated as hospitality and respect. Poszanowanie and gościnność. These carry certain connotations and tiny associations which are lost in translation. For this discussion, we'll simplify that hospitality and respect are something obligatory, both attitudes and actions carried out because most people agree they're just fundamentally important. So says the old expression that in Poland dates to at least the 1400s, that within the home the guest is like God, that Poland's great king Piast was blessed with the divine right to rule for showing his guests good hospitality. Beyond these laws of conduct which treat neighbors as cousins and cousins as brothers, there are a few more concepts that might seem obvious at first glance. Polytheists believe in multiple gods, but the implications of what that mean vary drastically. Many Slavic polytheists shared the view common to ancient Europe and West Asia that the hundreds of gods from dozens of regions are all real in some way. The idea of a one true religion was mostly developed by Christianity. European and West Asian religions before it acknowledged a multitude of divinity, just sometimes making arguments for why local divinities should be worshipped over the others. So an ancient polytheist might value their own gods more highly, but they would still recognize the existence of other gods, and they frequently adopted gods from other religions into their own. So pantheons, as we now imagine them, were built up over time, as city-states or tribal alliances traded local gods with one another until everything collected into a larger tradition. In the ancient world, what a god even was would vary across regions and religions within a single region over time. The Greek gods, for example, were named theoi, and different groups of Greeks, like Stoics or Platonists, would disagree on what their gods even were and how society would interact with them. Theoi basically derived from words for placing or doing, so Greeks more or less called their gods the doers or placers. Unlike modern pop culture, which shows Greek gods almost like superheroes, beings with one physical body and incredible powers, the historical Greek gods were seen as something like a non-material or partially material mind which was present across much of existence. So Zeus was the source of thunder, fatherhood, and leadership, so he would be present within lightning itself in the actions of fathers, and within expressions of leadership like government meetings. Their non-material nature is how they could live on Mount Olympus, despite clearly not physically living on Mount Olympus, and how they could travel anywhere, take disguises, or speak into the minds of mortals. The bodies given to them by art and mythology were just metaphorical frames of much more complicated beings. Stories which give them bodies are using these bodies as symbolism and metaphorical tools, so events like Kronos eating his children who become fully grown in his gut, or Zeus giving birth to a fully armored Athena from his own mind, aren't any more literal than the stories of mortals physically meeting the gods face to face at Olympus. Mythology was not meant to be a perfect literal description of things that happened. It meant to convey the general important ideas, so apart from their incredible almighty power, the Greek gods didn't exactly have fixed bodies the way that pop culture has come to see them now. To understand Slavic religion, we need to understand how Slavs saw their own gods, because they didn't see them as superheroes either, but they also didn't necessarily see them the way that the Greeks saw their own. The Slavs named their gods Bogowie, literally luck, meaning the sources of luck or the givers of fortune. Their gods are defined not as the literal sources of everything or present everywhere, but primarily as the forces which specifically cause good or bad things that happen in life. When this is combined with artistic depictions and ideas of cosmology and philosophy, we can understand how the Slavs knew their gods. The polytheist tribes were animists, meaning that they thought every animal, plant, and even natural force like a storm is given its own type of soul. While the animals and humans and plants are different, they're also equal to one another fundamentally. They have the same kind of souls, and mutual existence can be seen as a sort of meta-democracy. Hundreds of minor spirits personified not only plants and rivers, but things like the stove, the bathhouse, the rainbow, the concept of midday, precious stones like amber, the coldness which causes sickness, the sense of belonging at home, and even the home as a building. Everything in the Slavic world was seen as a living spirit, and as the real physical object which the spirit inhabited. The guardian of the forest was also the forest as a whole, every physical thing which made it, but each tree and river and rock and mushroom was also seen as its own little spirit, who are just one part of the larger. The animism of the Slavs was the context to their theology, and the Bogowie, the givers of luck, were parts of nature, parts of that same chain of mutual respect. Animals must respect nature or they starve, and humans must respect animals and nature alike or they starve, and the gods respect humans, animals, and nature. All of nature is built on this chain of mutual care. The gods wish to care for humans and look after after them, much the same way that many humans will care for cats or dogs or sheep or cattle. The multitude of divine, semi-divine, and non-divine life are just different beings of equal worth, all populating a larger life, in which everything thrives the most by respecting and helping the other. So Slavs see their gods not as almighty or all-powerful, not necessarily omnipotent nor omnipresent, but as just another type of living soul, which are giving their own role and their own abilities, and their own bodies, simply beyond what we as humans can do, just as we as humans have our own roles and abilities which are different than those of animals, and animals to plants, plants to objects, just as animals can befriend humans, and the two can share a mutually helpful and healthy, genuine friendship. Humans can do similarly through worship of the Bogowie. Everything in reality is its own sort of family on the largest big scale, just as Slavs value democracy and hospitality among each other, and extend hospitality to any well-meaning strangers. The same commitment to hospitality and respect also extended to nature as a whole. So these rules which bound humans together, and bound humans with animals, and to the places that they lived, also built connections between humans and the Bogowie on the largest level, just as there are rules of respect which people must adhere to when they visit another's home as their guest. You could say humans have similar obligations as guests in the homes of the Bogowie. Most of the idols and sacred art of the gods that we know from history were depicted with several faces on a single body. Multifaceted gods dominated the artistic output of the Western Slavs, while fewer idols survived in the East directly, but their folklore seemed to blend ideas of several faces with many different gods who are siblings, who share one large domain between many individuals, having many individuals for one concept rather than many faces on a single torso. Slavic Bogowie are examples of pluralistic polymorphs, meaning that a single god had many separate faces to speak from, and each face might be seen as a separate god, while also still being a component of a larger deity. One face might be friendly and compassionate, while another is stern and rigid. There is no evil or holy per se, because every god had a capacity to harm and a capacity to help. The givers of fortune can equally take it away, and the faces of the gods reflect the many different manifestations of their attributes, the complexity and nuances of their domains, and the shifting and changing nature of the gods themselves. Nothing in life is ever static. Even the seasons and the earth itself grow and change as the year progresses, and the gods are no exception. Most gods are tied in one way or another to a yearly cycle of rebirth and death, or of defeat and resurgence. There are the obvious seasonal deities, but even Father Sky himself shrinks to the form of an elderly man under the weight of the winter, until the day of Holy Thunder in February when he turns the tide against the demons. They always have a common, consistent core to them, but the details of the gods, the faces that they put on, the specific forms that they take, can vary, changing depending on what's needed. This trait is found in other religions to an extent. For example, Mother Kali can be seen as both a nurturing, protective mother and a fearsome goddess of death. Her domain might seem contradictory to an English speaker, but both are equally of her. While Hindus or Egyptians tended to express these ideas by giving different forms of their gods their own titles, as sometimes the son of Ra was also just another version of Ra. Slavic symbolism basically went one step further, often depicting the whole being including the smaller components all at once. Greeks might be reminded of their fates, who split one domain equally between three sisters, or of their goddess Hecate, who is often depicted as three goddesses standing together in a huddle. Ideas similar to these Greek triple gods can be seen on a much larger scale within basically every Slavic deity. We'll explore this more in the future as we look at individual gods, but many tribes knew unique local gods with unique local labels who were very similar in both name and function to dozens of other gods, and it often seems, maybe not always but frequently, that these gods were not just regional gods, but the regional forms or faces of wider spread deities who became individual patrons to individual settlements and communities. This understandably might be a little confusing to people who aren't used to this kind of idea, but the best advice is to resist the modern impulse to place a deity into a tidy box or label them in a singular manner. Deities aren't superheroes. Just interact with the god the way that you feel drawn to, and they'll help you understand which face or sibling or name that they want you to use in your relationship with them. And your relationship to that god might seem very different superficially to other relationships with other people. They might even seem like they contradict, but that doesn't mean that either of you are wrong. The Bogowie are just incredibly different from modern pop culture ideas of divinities. In a similar sense, there are many things that humans do every day that will go right over the head of the animals we befriend. Your cat probably doesn't understand things like the economy, or crippling debt, or why you're so anxious about a war happening on the other side of the world. They don't have concepts like that, but they can still emotionally understand you, and they know when you need comfort. And in that same way, we might not understand everything about the divine, but we can connect to them on an emotional level. Historically, hundreds of tribes and tribal alliances each held their own few patron deities, and each had their own variants of the family of gods and spirits. But regardless of the immense diversity between Slavs, no matter where you went in their world, a handful of deities would tend to be worshipped almost everywhere. Some scholars call these the pan-Slavic gods. I will usually refer to them as widespread, and we will now go over a few of these most widespread and significant gods. Across hundreds of years of Christian accounts, the most prevalent idea we see is a sky god who holds a special authority higher than most others, and who creates lightning. More often than not, this figure is Perun, whose name grew from ancient words for flying or striking quickly, and this later became the word for lightning. Perun is the patriarch or king of most or many other gods, but this is according to concepts of kingship created by the Proto-Slavs, which we discussed briefly in our video about the history of Poland. These were warriors who would get elected by democratic communities to serve on a federation's democratic council, who then elected the king of the tribal alliance. Rather than valuing birthright, wealth, or absolute might, they elected representatives according to lived experience, preferring community elders. Through the values of those high-ranking warriors who swore their oaths to Perun, we see his domain over wisdom, dedication to community and family, and the creation and maintenance of a society. The god whose steady rulership maintains the very bedrock of civilization. Sometimes called the god of war, his domain might better be summarized as god of defending one's family, the giver and maintainer of moral law and wisdom, a wise and experienced god of passion, compassion, wit, wisdom, a fast temper, and the fiery drive of the heart to do what's right and protect the people one loves. Perun was associated with the color red, worn as a color of protection even in modern Slavic countries, along with axe-shaped pendants worn by both warrior devotees and by civilian family members, including children, and the rosette, or sunflower, little rose or little sun, which was carved or painted on the exteriors of buildings, especially over doorways, to cast the protective light of Perun over the household and keep the family safe, though it can also be associated with other gods, particularly the goddesses who are likely his sisters. White birds and the oak tree also remained symbols to evoke him, even centuries deep into Christianity and double faith. You could say that his symbolism has left a bit of a lasting mark on Slavic culture. But just as each day eventually gives way to night, only to repeat, the darkness to Perun's light is the god Veles, whose name loosely translates to the damp one or woolly one. While Perun rules over the sky, Veles dwells deep in his afterlife, where he tends to the spirits of dead polytheists, like a rancher tends to their beloved cattle. On Earth, Veles holds domain over livestock and domestic pets, along with wild creatures like bears and wolves. Personifying the damp and dark places of the world. He's the source of the magic which flows so strongly through wetlands, swamps, and caves, and the creator of creatures like reptiles and amphibians who dwell in his domain, and who can pass through his secret caves to enter and exit the afterlife freely. But despite his role caring for the afterlife, Veles is typically not the god who causes death itself. It would be more accurate to call Veles the god of the unknown, of ambiguity and uncertainty, a god of change, and the disorder and chaos that follows the ending of a time, a shifting counterforce against steady order. To quote a community member who I think explained him well, we could simplify the role of Veles as a god of the unknown, of the potentials beyond perceived boundaries of culture. One will find his essence in the depths of the forest, eternally darkened by treetops and foliage, where people found food and medicinal herbs, but could easily be devoured by wild beasts or poisoned by berries and mushrooms. He is also deep in the underground, as the god who resides in mines, where one can be crushed by digging, or poisoned and suffocated by underground gases, or rewarded with precious metals and gems. Similarly, he resides in the other world, the place unreachable to the common folk. Volos has much to do with the unknown which is just past the threshold, the uncertainty just out of view, the unknown creature in the tree line who avoids your light, and the final uncertainty of death. To live life is to confront the unknown, and receive whatever curses or blesses are obscured by that mystery, and the essence of this mystery which gives way to either fortune or failure is Volos. Christians likened him to the devil, though it's interesting that even in their stories the devil took all souls when they died and could be just as helpful as he was harmful. Some modern polytheists link him to evil, but evil wasn't really an idea known to the ancient Slavs. Like the winter or the night, Volos simply is. He exists as an opposite to the gods above. He is the god of domains which conflict with them, but that doesn't make either of them good or evil, God or Satan. Early scholarship was quick to paint Perun and Volos as sworn enemies, but while that might have been true for some tribes, especially some in the east, we can now see more nuance to their relationship, and many polytheists have come to see Volos and Perun as having something closer to a sibling rivalry. If someone was listing the most important deities of the Slavs, then along with the symbolic brothers of orderly lightness and uncertain darkness, the third most important to list is the balancing stone between them, Mokosh, whose name derives from water, and who might or might not be the same as another goddess, Zemlya, literally motherland. Some polytheists maintain the two are separate goddesses, some that they're one and the same, and some that they're two parts of a larger whole, and those questions will be explored in our upcoming video, but for now we'll keep it more general. Whether one deity or two, Zemlya is the goddess of vegetation, fertile soil, and growth, the mother of life itself, since all plants grow from her earthly womb, and all other life relies on her continual renewal of nature. Likewise, especially in the East, there are Slavs who see her as the goddess of death, as all life returns to her soil to be recycled and remade into another generation. Mokosh is also a mother goddess, but more in regards to human and animal motherhood, the pregnancy and childbirth within matriarchal tribes. She's also the goddess of the unbroken line of mothers. In the time before Christianity, before the expectation for all women to become mothers, there were some women who would become warriors and others merchants, and those women who chose motherhood did so religiously, opting into the sacred cult of the motherhood and matriarchy. Historians do not record much that was definitive or clear about the cults of Mokosh historically, since the Christian descriptions were either too disgusted to give any details other than painting them as sinful fornicators, or they went into so much extraneous detail that they probably didn't know what they were talking about and were making things up. Through the descending dual-faith traditions, Mokosh's role over reproduction and the continuation of life somewhat dimmed, but her place over motherhood and mothers remained strong in the roles of cooking, kitchen magic, the craft of sewing and embroidery, surviving until now in the expression of the motherland and the vital role that Mary tends to play in Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, both tied to the cultural memory of the importance of the mother goddess. Early in the 1970s through 1990s, when international academia on Slavic polytheism was finally just starting to take off, those scholars imagined Volos, Mokosh, and Perun as characters in a tragedy, with Volos kidnapping the wife of Perun and holding her hostage in the underworld, until Perun came to the rescue with his lightning, explaining both the origin of their conflict, the seasons, and the storms. While this story did genuinely seem to exist in at least a few tribes, probably mostly in the northeast, it now seems very unlikely that it existed on a larger pan-Slavic scale, both because it meshes awkwardly with the goddesses of seasons found in Western and Southern traditions, and because an ongoing perpetual conflict doesn't connect with the lack of good or evil in the values of most Slavic regions. So returning to the creation story, many scholars now take a different, more popular interpretation of the role between the gods, seeing Volos and Perun almost like rival brothers, maybe rival husbands, rival fatherly figures, two figures who compete over Mokosh, but from their various competitions and alliances have arisen the rest of creation. This creates a triple association between these deities as mutual creators, and this triple nature can be seen in one of the prevalent surviving variants of the Slavic creation myth, telling how the earth as we know it originated. Several of these renditions survive, but I'll tell one I know the best, originating from Poland. All others are fairly similar, but also have a few differences. In the beginning, there was nothing, except the sky, the sea, the god who sailed on his boat, and the devil emerging from the sea foam, who sat down beside God. The devil wished to create the world but couldn't do it alone, so he suggested it to God, who agreed to his plan. So God sent the devil down beneath the primordial ocean, and the devil surfaced with either a handful or a mouthful of sand from the waters, and God took the sand and threw it onto the surface, and it grew into the very first land, so thin that the two could barely fit beside each other on it. God and the devil lived on this land, and once God had fallen asleep, the devil decided to push him into the water to make more room for himself. But when he pushed the sleeping god, the land beneath him grew. The devil pushed, and his legs slid back from the struggle, making more land to the east. And instead of allowing his falling into the ocean, where God was pushed, the land extended to the west. Eventually, God awoke and caught the devil in the scheme, and the two creators started to fight. So God flew to heaven, produced a lightning bolt, and knocked the devil off the land deep into the abyssal sea. Obviously, the names and details have been changed by Christianity, but we can make out the general form of Veles in the devil, and we make out the form of Perun in the lightning thrown upon the devil. We see two gods as equals, two mutual creators who needed each other to begin their world. Their status as good and evil, impacted a bit by Christianity, but the position of God opposite devil, rather than the devil as one of many angels, managed to survive Christianization. And we can spot Mokosh, arising from the waters which give metaphorical birth to the land, itself brought up through the passions of the creators. While she is not given a physical characterization the way God and devil are, we can see the agency and importance of the motherland in her willingness to expand herself to accommodate both creators, making her a creator of herself. After the banishing of the devil to the bottom of existence, often the god in heaven specifically speaks to the Earth Mother, giving her authority over all of her creations as the queen of her own existence. The only note of contention in this creation story is the identity of the god of light. It is very obvious that Perun is the god who strikes down the Veles by the time that lightning is thrown, but there is evidence, which is better reflected in other versions of the creation story, which might suggest that the god to begin creation was a father of Perun, very likely the god who many identify as the Bog Absolute, the god of everything, named in most traditions as likely Svarog, who will be discussed shortly, but we'll leave this for now. You can learn more about it in the video about the cosmos, or the upcoming video about Svarog. In some versions of this creation, such as a song from the Russians, the boat itself is instead an oak tree, tying into a similar belief shared among the Slavs that some viewers might be familiar with due to its presence in Germanic or Nordic mythology, as the Slavs often believed in a metaphorical cosmic tree, which for the Nords held the 9 realms in its various roots and branches. But the Slavs knew their own type of tree in a much simpler form. At the top of their world tree were the branches of the sky, typically the home of Perun. In the middle is where the trunk met the soil, where grasses and brushes give food and shelter and life, representing the domain of Mokosh. And at the bottom are the roots, the dark moist soil, which meet the infinite ever-expanding sea. This is the home of Veles and the afterlife he cares for. But the form of the cosmic tree is a bit further explored in our video about the Zhozha and the cosmos. Along with these 3 most important creators are a few important but increasingly complicated and varied divinities. Both the Royanis and the Rod were clearly important, but their functions are complicated and commonly debated. Rod is a linguistic root which means family, so Rod is likely the god of family, but what his domain specifically means and what he does or doesn't do isn't very clear. He likely relates to the values of respect and hospitality. The Slavs were eager to spread their family and marry spouses from new cultures, to connect adapt their culture to new people. So Rod could be related to marriage or fertility or parenthood or really anything. Some researchers identify him as the god of hearth, or the household oven, which could make him analogous to the minor household spirit of the Domovoi, who both personified the oven, or the home, and lived inside it as a small goblin-like creature. Many modern Slavic polytheists identify Rod as the Bog absolute. This identification is certainly possible, but does not seem to be the most frequently made historically. There's so many different ways to read Rod that this video doesn't have nearly enough time, while the Royanis are a group of sisters, numbering anywhere from 3 to 9, who have something to do with Rod, and who all share their domains over fate and the matriarchal line of mothers, which are also traits identified especially with the Eastern Mokosh, so this all gets really complicated. The Royanis are represented by sowing, and at the birth of a child they begin sowing their fate, and potentially come to Earth to show themselves to people either shortly after they were born, just before life-changing events, or shortly before they pass away. So these are probably understood best as goddesses of fate in a big picture sort of way, and this concept of fate has more flexibility than it does in other religions. It might be better translated as fortune. Additionally, there was another sort of goddess called Doda, who personified fate and was said to be assigned to children at birth, and then to accompany the child throughout their lives as they grew into an adult, as a constant and invisible companion, helping to ensure that everything was playing out how it should. Through the relationship one had with their own Doda, this ongoing praxis would affect how fortunate or unfortunate a person was in their life. Fate was much more flexible than fate in other systems, the product of the respect and relationship built between a person and the various goddesses of fate, rather than a rigid, predetermined force. All this said, the exact relationship between Doda and Royanis isn't certain, and rather than working together, they may have just been two regional variants or equivalents. I can only seem to find Doda in the Slavic West. Likewise, Royanis are very prevalent in the South. In the East seem to apply much of this to Mokosh. We don't really know how unified or disunified this theology was in antiquity. And while we're on that topic, we ought to discuss a misconception or miscommunication which frequently causes issues in learning about Slavic polytheism. There is one popular perspective that almost nothing was actually known about the Slavic gods, and any information claimed about how the gods were worshipped historically, or even basic information about the fundamentals of the Slavic cosmology, are simply things which have been made up in the present day. Any modern scholar of Slavic polytheism would fervently disagree with it. But this perception persists due to a mix of the hangover of bad scholarship from the 18 and 1900s, along with the simple struggle of accessing most or any of this information in English or even outside of their countries of origin. It happens a million times in Slavic polytheist spaces that someone will mention something from, say, Czech scholarship, which is incredibly established and well known among Czechs, but the, say, Russians in the community have simply never heard of it, because still, even today, the communication between these nations is subpar, and it drastically affects the quality and accessibility of information. The other perception is more accurate. Thanks to the multitude of both historical sources written in the distant past by outsiders and the multitude of chronicles, sermons, and church resources, along with extensive catalogs of annuals and folkloric research which continue seamlessly from the days of polytheism to modernity, we have extensive data which in the distant past illuminate the beliefs of the polytheist Slavs, and as we approach modernity illuminate how these holidays and customs transformed under the influence of Christianity to endure, but without the explicit polytheism. A prevalent example is the Slavic custom on Pentecost of painting and exchanging eggs, that young girls will make eggs which represent the fertility of nature, and these will be gifted to boys that they fancy, in return for being splashed with water or playfully hit with sticks, and often the girls will have an opportunity to splash or smack the boys back, in a sort of chaotic but playful war for eggs, which nowadays has persisted but has gradually lost the association of the sacredness of fertility within the egg, the holiday becoming much more of a water gun fight, where all children are encouraged to just absolutely splash each other with water. Obviously, this holiday did not originate from Christianity, since there is nothing in the Bible about the fertility of eggs. Instead, it was incorporated into Christianity as a a prevalent cultural custom which the people did not want to abandon simply because it had polytheist origins, and over time it has continued to adapt to what people want out of holidays today. So whether you consider the modern holiday with water guns to be Christian, polytheist, or simply a cultural custom is really up to your personal interpretation and where you draw the line, but the history that has resulted in this modern custom undoubtedly began with a polytheist, and we can trace that journey very clearly. Also important are Svarog and his sons, but the names and identities of his children or child are hotly contested. We know for sure that Svarog is the god of fire, but the single historical account even describing him is highly flawed, that it's hard to even tell what the author was trying to say. But we know Svarog is authentic because his son, Svarovich, literally child of Svarog, is frequently mentioned through a variety of historical sources. The son seems to be the god of fire, like his father, but his father seems he may be the elemental fire versus terrestrial fire, or there might be something else going on. The exact nature of how they differ is contentious. Svarovich seemed to be a war god associated with the forging of weapons, but this association comes from the Slavic far west, where most gods earned war attributions thanks to their 300-year war, so we aren't sure whether war was a core attribute of his, like how war is a core attribute to the Greek Ares, or if it was an additional attribute simply gained through existing through prolonged periods of wartime. Svarovich is also less of a proper name and more like a nickname, a name of endearment, so it might only be the title for a god with another name altogether, and from there scholars sometimes point to attributes of fire and war, and declare that Svarovich is just a title for Perun or Dazbog or many other gods mentioned in the histories. Likewise, we have records of Svarovich as the patron deity of a city called Radgost among the Polybian Slavs, but we also have accounts of a separate deity of fire and generosity who was named Radigost, the same name as the city. So was Radigost the name of Svarovich as the patron of Radigost? Or is something else going on? It's incredibly unclear. So it could logically be the case that Svarovich is the same deity as Radigost or Delsbog, or that these gods may be the sons or brothers of each other. Most of these interpretations have fairly solid arguments and dozens of papers spelling out these arguments. So in the future, these will be explored in deeper detail. We've already somewhat discussed one theory, that Svarovich might be the title of a deity known as Lado, or Lyodom, which is mentioned in the video about Lada. But for now, all of these extensive theories will have to wait for their own videos, and in this video, we'll just say it seems Svarovich is a god of fire and war. The god of fire and the fire's existence as physical form on Earth is remembered through the Slavic holiday of Midsummer, or Kupawa night. This night, the anniversary when fire was created, came to Earth, and is at its height of power and fertility upon the Earth. In Poland, this is the renewal of the undying fire, which survives throughout the year. While the Slavic East knew several different traditions of seasonal goddesses, from some principalities who knew only Mokosh as the controller of all the seasons alone, to others who knew possibly 4 or more minor goddesses who divided the year. But in the Slavic West and South, there are overwhelmingly 2 goddesses who divide the year. These are Zevona and Marjona, the goddesses of wilderness and summer, and of agriculture, winter, dreams, and death. Both goddesses were known to be major patrons of several tribes among the southern Poles. Among the southern Polans, the state happened to be founded on an area containing vast forests and groves that the ancient people believed to be inhabited by Diana, and that Diana claimed power over. Ceres, on the other hand, was considered the mother goddess of harvests the country needed. Therefore, these 2 goddesses, Diana in their own language Zevona, and Ceres, called Marjona, enjoyed a special cult and devotion. Both these goddesses are preserved in the holiday ritual named the Drowning of Marjona, enacted on or around the spring equinox, which both marks Marjona's return to the afterlife and Zevona's return from the afterlife to bring back spring and summer. It was still in my memory that on White Sunday they drowned an idol, one having dressed in a sheath of hemp or straw in human clothing, which was shown about the whole village. At the nearest lake or puddle, after removing the clothes, they threw it into the water, singing mournfully, "Death twists at the fence. Let us seek trouble." Then they would run home from that place as soon as possible. Whoever fell then had the prophecy that he would die that year. They called the idol Marjonna, and over time Marjonna gave her name to a multitude of spirits, ghosts, and demons in Christianized folklore, all deriving from her name, which itself derived from words for death. Her role as goddess of winter is inherently linked to her role as goddess of death and sleep, since the Slavs saw death and sleep as very similar things. When one slept, they believed the soul would wander from the body, much like it does in death, but only temporary, and those who dreamt of being animals or fighting spirits were thought to really be doing so as their spirits roamed free and interacted with others. The connection between the wandering soul and illusions and deceptive magic is not directly seen in historical records, but is reflected by Marjonna basically being used as a word for crazy or insane people in Slavic languages today. As the divine meaning of her name faded, her magical power over dreams, illusions, and deception became the part of her which many people remembered most strongly, probably because magic really scared early Christians. Meanwhile, Zevonna, goddess of wilderness, wildlife, and hunting, gave her name to a plant which in English is called mullein, collected historically for use in medicinal remedies for respiratory and digestive infections, and also made into candle wicks and burned for the holiday of Candlemas, the holiday which best preserves her figure through the image of Mary, the wanderer of winter, the tamer of wolves, the protector of children. We will highlight that while Zevonna is definitely tied to the summer and warmth, she does not seem to be the deity who primarily personifies it the way that her sister and opposite personifies the winter. Rather, to Poles, the summer is primarily personified by a young Lelia, a young girl who Zevonna accompanies, while to the east and south, often the summer bearer is a young man, Yarillo. Along with the goddesses of wilderness and agriculture are goddesses above them, Zhozha. Her name literally translating to dawn, Zhozha can actually describe the low light at the beginning and the end of the day, and she is sometimes a single goddess, but most often 2 to 3 sisters, representing morning and evening, morning, noon, and evening, morning, evening, and night, though some regions number them at 4 or even greater. Folklore places Zhozha on an island or mountain, where they live with the sun or the moon, who might be their lover or spouse, though the variance of this outnumbers the number of Slavic nations. The sun and moon are also given divine personifications. In most, the sun is a young lady and the moon a young prince, who court and chase each other as their love pulls them across the sky, though many regions also swap their genders or add a tragedy to their mythology. It's also worth exploring that these personifications of the sun might not be the same as, and might not contradict, with gods of the sun, such as Dazbog. There might be something similar to Greek mythology, where the literal personification of the moon is a goddess Selene, but other goddesses like Artemis also have the moon as one of their domains. The Zhozha sisters, or the polymorphic Zhozha goddess, often also live alongside the stars, who folklore treats as a wide variety of ladies and princes, and sometimes these stars might be the children of more major gods. And while many Slavs consider Mokosh and Perun to be the ancestors, the creators of humanity, there are also Slavs who credit this to the sun and moon, or to the stars.
Embarking on an excursion to Poland with a local man, he met the man's sister, Elsa, who lived shoulder to shoulder with the indigenous Kurpai people in the White Wilderness Forest. In their culture, they believed that such shape-shifting creatures descended from the stars many thousands of years ago, establishing themselves all over the world. The White Wilderness Forest, she explained, served as a sort of portal for these creatures to easily access the human world in greater numbers, much akin to what Skinwalker Ranch is in America. According to her husband, a Kurpai native, The American skinwalker and the bee...
Okay, first off, the Kerpis are native to the White Forest in the same way that Krakowians are native to Krakow. There are a bunch of different Polish ethnicities who are native to the region of Poland. That's just how ethnicities work. The only reason he's emphasizing their indigenousness is to try to make them sound more mystical and mysterious and make their folklore sound ancient and magic, and it's... ugh. More importantly, the Kerpis believe that everything came from the stars, because the Kerpi folklore, much like the folklore of many Pomeranians and Maslovians, believe that the creator deities who created all of life are the sun and the moon who created the stars, and the stars are the ancestors who create all of life on Earth. It's nothing to do with aliens. Aliens have nothing to do with it. It's just the cosmology. It's just what they believe. There's nothing special about the strangers who can change their form. And yes, it is taboo to say the name of the strangers, but they aren't unique to Kerpi folklore, they're not unique to Poland, you can find them in the folklore of Russians. So if you want to learn their name, you can learn it from the Russians. This is so infuriating because it's pretending so hard that it's respectful, but it's so disrespectful. It's taking folklore and mangling it into a horror story. It's so disrespectful, but it's pretending so hard that it's respectful. Lastly, for our widespread Slavic deities, I will touch on the highly contentious Lada. I have already made an almost 2-hour video explaining the historicity of this deity and the many sources in folklore and history which attest her. It is very common for people, especially in internet discourse, to dismiss the deity of Lada. Without recounting everything that I talk about in that video, I'll simply say there is not sufficient evidence to discredit this deity, and there is abundant evidence of this deity's historicity. That said, their exact role and function within religion must mostly be inferred by their role in their surviving holidays, much like the goddess Marzhonna and her role over the winter. Therefore, we can infer that the Lada has significant authority over the summertime and over the domain of lovers, fiancés, people who are becoming married. But anything beyond that must be left for examination in the long video about her. And if you comment on this video that she is historically fraudulent, I'll know that you didn't watch this video all the way through. Take those comments to that video. Alongside these significant deities with major roles who were present across most of the Slavic world are also deities who seem to be widespread, but their roles much more minor, and therefore they are less attested by history, such as Doldola, or Peruna, the companion of the storm god Perun, who herself is responsible for the rains. Alongside them are many different gods who partition the various winds, which originate from the 4 directions. Therefore, there are many, many different names for many gods of wind. Likewise, the places of the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the North Sea are frequently embodied by their own deities, who are given names which vary by the folktale, but their personalities and presences are consistent. For almost any major river, body of water, mountain, or ravine, there is likely a well-established deity in that region's folklore. Also numerous are figures like the 12 months and their leader, the King of Time. Many concepts like time and the harvest, the fields, and the crops are personified by spirits and minor deities. So across the Slavic world, while they're called dozens of different names, many deities of the fields or the forests have very similar commonalities in their natures. Many of these spirits, especially in relation to the winter holidays, can be grouped between the white ones and beautiful ones against the black ones or the ugly ones. These spirits who would conventionally be compared to the saints and angels versus those who would be Christianized as demons. But despite their breaking into 2 categories, these should not be mistaken as holy versus satanic. Most overwhelmingly, the black demons represent the winter, the hardship, the times of want. And true to the nature of the divine, as both the givers and the takers away of fortune, the black cannot exist without the white, and the white cannot without the black. With most of the so-called pan-Slavic gods already touched on, we'll take a look at just a few regional gods. Krezhnik, often identified with Yerji or Yarilo, the shining god of spring and summertime, and his companion or counterpart Yarnik, are the youthful gods who tend to be overlooked in pan-Slavic discussions, who survive today mostly in Slovenia and parts of Croatia. Each of them are typically interpreted as children of other gods. Krezhnik often is seen as the son of Perun, who sometimes otherwise is seen as another face of the great polytheism. polymorphic god. Krajnik is the child or guardian of the sun and is the god of the summer solstice, who pulls or escorts the sun across the sky, and is a creator of lightning and the summer storms which accompany the sun. He lives atop the mythical glass or crystal mountain, where he might roam his wilderness as a stag or ram with golden horns, along with his wife or the priestesses who aid him, typically named Vesna, they themselves symbolic of fertility in spring. If Yarilo is not the same, then he, or Yarji, is the god who goes on the symbolic journey of the year. Each spring as a young boy he personifies the start, the growth from rebirth, and across summer he falls into the underworld, and in autumn he is taken to the afterlife, only in winter to emerge again. Whether Yarji is the same as those two or his own figure, he and Yarnik are two brothers who personify opposites, one a hero associated with spring and summer, snakes and the thriving of life, and the other is the shepherd of wolves, roaming the winter with his deadly flock. Both brothers are locked in a cycle of struggle or betrayal, which can vary according to the storyteller. And depending on how we define a god, the Balkans can be home to at least a dozen more, but we can move on from that region for now, because they interlap with each other heavily. Back in the north, among the West Slavs, folklore shows dozens more gods, from the Lord of Snakes to the Golden Stag, who might or might not relate to Perun or Jevonna, to the Queen of the Baltic Sea and her tyrannical father, the Amber King, to the many gods who are the protectors of the Carpathian Mountains and the chains which descend from them. The Pomeranians and Polabians give us the most written material about any Slavic gods through the Danish, German, and Polish Christian writers. We've already alluded to the gods of Polabia, famous for their idols with many faces, from Rugit, the roaring deer god of sex and war, to Chernoglav, the black-haired god of victory, and the very last idol to have his temple destroyed. But of them all, the most famous are likely Chernobog, the black god, who is probably the most hotly debated and controversial of all Slavic gods, thanks to the especially heavy bias in our accounts of his worship. If he really was his own god and not a title or misrepresentation of another god like Volos, then Chernobog was likely the god of misfortune, bad luck, and the black demons. Chernobog had a counterpart, Belebog, who himself, likewise, may have simply been the title for another god such as Perun, but if he was his own god, he was the god of white luck, or fortunate times. Turning our attention to the east, much discussion is dominated by the primary chronicle and the temple in Kiev which was built by King Vladimir. It's important to understand in historical context that Vladimir was a reformer. He took in his domain many different peoples, and it seems that the gods he selected for his temple were meant to syncretize the many faiths in his domain. In his temple was Perun, which he likely meant to syncretize with Thor, was Mokosh, who he likely meant to syncretize with the Uralic goddess of earth, was the god Kors, who is likely the god of either the moon or sun, who was likely meant to syncretize with the gods of the Iranic-speaking minority of his domain. Understanding that Vladimir's pantheon was effectively and intrinsically an attempt to unify many disparate people under one belief, it makes sense that he was soon, within just a few decades, able to cut this pantheon down and replace it with Christianity. Therefore, when many people strive to understand the complexity and entirety of Slavic religion through the lens of Vladimir's pantheon, we'll instead accept that it was primarily politically motivated, and therefore we do not need to get deeply into it for understanding overall Slavic religion. But it will be important if you want to specifically channel a sort of centralized Rus identity. As we discuss in our Perun video, the authentic and non-politicized faith of the Eastern Slavs of the time might be better represented by the older temples found in the Carpathian region, and we discuss how this reflects the faith of the time extensively in our Perun video. To summarize what we've learned, the religion of the Slavs, even from antiquity, was incredibly diverse and complicated, and as Christianity spread and the religion became intertwined with Christianity, this only became more complicated. Many villages from the 1300s through to today have slowly, gradually changed their folklore to preserve what's been most important to them. And through this process, even though many of these people might not identify as polytheist, they would not necessarily identify identify as Christian either. It is a situation of many villages and many people simply telling the stories that their ancestors have always told. And through this, in a way, the polytheistic religion and mythology has survived. Therefore, today there are two main sources that modern polytheists draw from. There are many who draw primarily from the folklore which has been passed down to them, and because of this, their religion heavily involves the de-Christianization of Christianized folklore, or they may simply accept Christianity as part of polytheism, continuing an interconnected and complicated dual faith. This is overwhelmingly the category that I personally fall towards, but I try to keep a balanced approach in my discussions and explorations. The other category of modern polytheists overwhelmingly seeks to disconnect themselves from Christianity, and therefore they overwhelmingly embrace the construction of a new polytheistic pantheon, or set of beliefs. These people take heavily through the histories and less from folklore, and they try to revitalize it into what could function in the modern day. This is generally called a Reconstructionist religion, and due to the varied sources that they take their information from, and due to the varied interactions with the divine that their modern priests partake in, these groups have overwhelmingly splintered into a multitude of different organizations which ferociously disagree with each other, but all seek to ultimately, hopefully, coexist, for lack of a better term. The first group, the so-called dual faith, can most easily be found at folk museums, at folklore societies and places that preserve the traditional ways. Again, many of these people do not identify openly as polytheists, but they're very eager to share their work. And while I am far more of a traditionalist, I do not believe that either group is better or worse than the other, though you will see in my comment sections people will frequently try to call me a Reconstructionist, and this is because while in Slavic countries there is generally respect for what is seen as a traditionalist, there's usually a degree of scorn that looks down on Reconstructionists in a similar way to a Westerner looking down on Wicca or New Age people. Traditionalists tend to get lumped in with Reconstructionists when a layperson isn't necessarily familiar with folklore. They probably grew up in a fairly modernized setting. Therefore, traditional things might become misconstrued as New Age. For a similar thing that happens in the West, I recommend videos by the Welsh Viking that illuminate how many aspects of actually traditional Old Germanic or English culture have become distorted by popular culture, so many people now do not necessarily recognize what is actually traditional, and the inventions of movie studios might be mistaken as traditional. This isn't any sort of big deal, it's just something that sort of inevitably happens with lay people. The other category are overwhelmingly organized into various modern groups who conduct themselves in very different ways. From those who believe strongly in magic and ceremony, who worship the gods very highly and treat them in an esteem similar to the Greeks or Romans with their own gods, as others take a strictly animist approach and look down on praying to deities at all, instead focusing their worship around nature itself directly. Among these major Reconstructionist groups are the primary churches of Poland, Slovakia, and Czechia. You can identify them because they are the large groups who are registered with the government. Overall, their beliefs are somewhat varied depending on the specific priest or local community that an adherent belongs to, rather than emphasizing strict unity throughout their churches. And overall, their beliefs are not that extreme. If one spends enough time studying the history of the Slavs, then they'll be able to trace where these beliefs are from. Many of these formal groups registered with their governments choose to take a name Rodnovery, or some other name related to that. Linguistically, all this means is native faith, and when spoken in a Slavic language, linguistically it is naturally assumed that it is the native faith of the language it is spoken in. But since native faith translates awkwardly into English, this is often transformed into a proper noun, Rodnovery, or Rodnovers. Since the Rodnovery became very prevalent and popular with the collapse of the USSR, which roughly coincided with the New Age spiritualist movement across the world and in the English-speaking world, many people with New Age tendencies also found their way to certain Rodnovery groups. Certain subsections in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s saw the rise of certain charismatic local leaders who created their own groups which splintered off in isolation. Therefore, when learning about Rodnovery, Rodnovery, someone might frequently come across a multitude of what can only be described as cults, but I will emphasize the context that this is not an issue inherent to Rodnovery or Slavic polytheism, but rather a consequence of the political instability and opened religious floodgates of the time. If one looks to Japan or the United States around the same time, they will also find similar cults. Along this discussion, I am tempted to talk about possibly one of the most influential groups along the culty lines, the Ivanovists, with their influential views about the divine feminine and incorporation of worldviews which English speakers might identify with more of the Wicca or New Age, but who are overall mostly harmless in their beliefs. In the other direction, the Junglists or Svarists, who can only be described as incredibly radical and fairly delirious, pushing extremist views and splintering off into further cults who thought the original cult simply was not hateful enough. Watchers might be confused by their name, which translates roughly to Old Believer. They have no affiliation with the actual Christian church, who are also called the Old Believers. The most notorious and influential New Age work has to be the so-called Book of Veles, a book which was written sometime in the mid-1900s, but reports to be an ancient, lost collection of wisdom, which survived the destruction of polytheism due to being engraved on secret golden tablets, which were it's the Book of Mormon. It's just the Mormonism of Slavs. While I do not wish to recount everything in it, the Book of Veles is the source of the many strange and overly complicated diagrams or family trees that you'll see online about the religion of the Slavs. If you see lists of names with 200 different deities and they're all very weirdly similar, and they're all definitely derived from Russian grammar, and the theology feels like it's trying too hard to be overly complicated and trying too hard to sound like Hinduism, that is certainly from the Book of Veles. It is absolute rubbish, but also thankfully the book itself is somewhat difficult to find online nowadays. So instead of making its misinformation more accessible, I'll simply say that enough has been said. Lastly, among the popular groups who are a bit more radical, I will mention the Anastasianists, a group in rural Russia and Siberia who were inspired by the Ringing Cedars of Anastasia book series released throughout the 90s and early 2000s. While they've gotten a lot of attention for being strange, the Anastasianists are fundamentally not that different from the American Amish. They have chosen to give up modern society and modern conveniences, and the myths presented in these book series are almost certainly not genuinely historical, but most adherents of Anastasianism don't seem to take it that way. They are not the fervent history rewriters that you get from some of the more hateful groups. Instead, these are overwhelmingly people who just want to go out and live in the forest on a traditional homestead. And much like the Amish who I live around and do work with in my day-to-day, I don't have a big issue with that. That said, much like the American Amish, they also don't accept modern medicine, so I do not wholly endorse them or anything either. Again, while certain news outlets will try to imply that extremism or other issues are overwhelmingly prevalent among Slavic polytheism, just as is the case with any New Age movement in the West, this is just for the sake of clicks. While there is extremism that exists within Slavic polytheism, it is not proportionally more extreme than any other counterculture or minority that you can find in any other prevalent nation. It's the same as it always is with every group you can think of. The media will focus on the bad to generate clicks and never address anyone else. I have 2 shorts talking about these issues, so if we want to get deeper into this, please go check out the shorts and start the discussion over there. With all of this said, you likely want to keep learning and likely have many questions you would like to ask. Thankfully, since this is the remastering of this video, I can now directly send you to several multi-hour videos about various prevalent Slavic deities. I recommend the video about Perun and the video about Lada. If you generally want to learn more and hear from diverse voices, the Rodnovery subreddit and its accompanying Discord are not terrible places to begin. I have a reading list for resources that I recommend you to begin with, will be listed in the description. It is a wide assortment of both historical writings, analysis of historical writings, and folkloric accounts to give you a balanced introduction. Theoretically, I will also have my own book of folklore that I will finish and publish eventually. It's a lot. It's a big project. This is my Sisyphean task. If you would like to see that project hopefully be finished faster, I guess I should also mention that I have a Patreon, which you can donate to specifically to accomplish that. All of this talking finally done, I hope to talk to you more again in another needlessly extensive video. If you have anything that you would like addressed, feel free to leave a comment, and I will either address your comment directly, reply to it in a future Q&A video, or perhaps even discuss it in an upcoming full-length video. As it is, thank you for watching, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. There's also an official playlist, so you can just sit back and let it take you through my recommended order of learning.